Hey everybody, this is Ben Casnocha, co-founder and partner at Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is our podcast, where we go deep on all things business and technology with world-leading experts.
Village Global co-founder and partner Ben Casnocha recently had a wide-ranging conversation with his longtime friend Auren Hoffman on Auren's World of DaaS podcast. We've cross-posted that conversation here on the Village Global feed. Enjoy.
Hello, data nerds. Welcome to World of DaaS. I'm your host, Auren Hoffman, CEO of SafeGraph and GP of Flex Capital. Discover more episodes, get weekly data as a service news at worldofdaas.com. That's spelled world of DAAS.com. Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Ben Casnocha. Ben is the co-founder and partner at Village Global, a early stage venture capital firm backed by tech luminaries, including Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg. Was the chief of staff to Reid Hoffman, and he co-authored two best-selling books with him, including The Alliance and The Startup of You. Ben, welcome to World of DaaS.
Thank you so much for having me, Warren.
I'm very excited. Now, we're old friends, so this is going to be a really fun conversation. Just to start, what are some non-obvious ways that people should be thinking about their careers? You're kind of a career guru, so how should people be thinking about that?
Well, yes, in a prior life, I spent a lot of time thinking about career strategy, learned a lot from you about career strategy. So I do want to turn the tables a little bit in this conversation, maybe when we get to networks and relationship building, because you have so many interesting views on that. But the premise of The Startup of You, which is the book that Reid and I wrote in 2012, and then we did a 10-year anniversary edition in 2022, is that you want to think about your career like a little startup, and that you might not be the CEO of your own company, but you're at least the CEO of your own career. And so you can take a lot of the principles and best practices of how entrepreneurs manage companies and apply those very things to your career. One of the key principles of the book is that adaptation is really key in business. A lot of startups have an initial idea and then pivot and adapt their idea as they encounter reality. The day one business plan rarely predicts the day 1000 reality at most startups. And so similarly, as all of us manage our careers, we have to take an approach of openness and flexibility and adaptability. We shouldn't be too rigid about goal setting or planning, and we should fully expect our lives to unfold in perhaps surprising ways.
When people think about optionality, some people love optionality, some people completely hate optionality. Where does that come in? Because optionality and flexibility are sometimes used synonymously.
We actually have a line in the book about this point, which is sometimes closing doors in the short term is what opens doors in the long term. And so sometimes decisions that seem to reduce your optionality now will, over time, actually create many more options. A common critique of young people today, that generation is obsessed with optionality, wary of any sort of long or medium-term commitment. And I think that critique is broadly correct. I actually think many great things can happen by setting up a plan or a commitment that does actually last a period of months or years. I think the key thing that we talk about in the Startup View is a mistake. And the old school career advice used to be go to college, graduate from college, set some long-term plan for your life, and then work backwards. And actually, a surprising number of very successful CEOs still actually give this advice to young professionals. They say, figure out where you want to be long-term, set that as your true north, and then work backwards. And the only way you'll get where you want to go is if you have that plan set out. It goes against the reality of how most startups evolve. And it's actually, if you study the successful careers of people like Sheryl Sandberg, who I first saw as a teenager at one of your events, Auren, I remember being so impressed by her at one of your forums. Sheryl's career unfolded in a very surprising manner. If you had asked her when she was in her early 20s, do you think that you will someday be a tech titan billionaire? She would have said, no way. She was doing public health projects in India. She was working for the World Bank. She was management consulting, worked in Washington. A very diverse and interesting and unexpected career that led her ultimately to Google and Facebook to become a tech titan. I think that's the case actually for many successful people. And that's the key insight that we all need to remember in our careers.
She wrote the book in 2012. You updated in 2022. When you rewrite the 2032 edition, what will change or how will you think you'll be updating it then?
There's this Jeff Bezos line about think about the things that don't change or won't change in our business. So he has this line about customers are always going to want low prices. That is an interesting frame for careers, which is what are the timeless principles of life? I have two views on this, but one I think you might disagree with, so maybe we should explore that. So the one that I think we'll probably both agree with is adaptability, I think, if anyone listening to this thinks the world's getting slower, easier to understand, et cetera, they're probably mistaken. There's a lot that's happening that's changing the world of work, of course, with AI and so forth. So being able to adapt and learn new skills 10 years hence is going to be even more important than it is today. I think the thing that I still believe, but I wonder, Auren, if you differ, is on the centrality of network. You've been writing a lot recently about it's not who you know, it's what you know. And you've reflected that one of your own transformations is that 20 years ago, maybe you thought network was really key, and today you think it's less important. I might take the opposite view on that, but maybe share your take on that.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Obviously, who you know is important, but you think it will be even more important in the future than it is today.
At least be as important, maybe more important as it is today. Whereas I think you've made the argument that it's kind of decreasing importance.
Do you think it's more important today than it was 30 years ago?
I think it is in sort of different ways. So obviously it's now like easy to find the names and titles of people. It used to be like you had to actually physically know somebody for them to tell you, oh, there's this dude, Auren Hoffman, who runs this company, SafeGraph. Whereas today, like I can just use LinkedIn and find the entire directory of all professionals. So in that sense, it's less important. The argument I'd make for why it will be as or more important is I think we have a serious trust issue. If you survey Americans today and their trust in institutions and the news and so forth are plummeting, I think with the rise of misinformation, fake information, we're going to increasingly rely upon humans whose identities we can verify telling us that this person is legit, that this company is legit, that this restaurant is good. And so I actually think using the centrality of network to make quality decisions in a world of misinformation, I could see that being really important. But what's your counter, or how do you think about it?
I think it's likely that it has been just generally decreasing of importance over the last few decades. The phrase, it's not what you know, who you know, I think was certainly true in the 80s. The dominant profession were the networkers who like put two what you knows together and they got a vig on the transaction. So whether it be a real estate agent or investment banker or a talent agent, and all the movies were about those people essentially. And the investment banker was actually the preeminent profession in many ways in the 80s. Very quickly, the investment banker got overtaken by the hedge fund manager. Hedge fund manager is much more of a what you know type of person. And the average salary of an investment banker today on like a relative basis is way lower than it was in the 80s. It used to go investment banker, lawyer, accountant, or something like that. And now the lawyers are making more than investment bankers. A bunch of investment bankers who used to be lawyers, they quit their job as investment bankers and went back to the law firm so they can make more money. You would have never heard that in the 80s of that happening.
One nuance is when you say the hedge fund person, it's a what you know business, not a who you know business. I'd argue that a lot of what hedge fund managers know is knowledge that's in the brains of people in their network. Great investors talk to smart people and try to understand what's in their head. So I think the what you know, who you know distinction blends where for a lot of these elite professions, it's being really great at accessing the knowledge in the heads of people in your network.
That's correct. So I think classically the who you knows were what you knows because they were getting this proprietary knowledge that other people weren't getting access to. In some ways today, we can listen to all these amazing people on podcasts. You can't get like fully in the brain of pick your favorite entrepreneur or something like that today. If you knew Mark Zuckerberg personally and you had a great relationship with him, yes, you can maybe get more in his brain, but like the average person has way more access to him than they did in the past. They can really hear what he's thinking. They can understand. And so you get access to at least some of the at least well thought out thoughts now than you wouldn't before.
It is interesting because I think you're right. You can listen in on the inner thoughts of people. That would be an argument for the network being less important. I would say, though, that we all would agree that there are things Mark Zuckerberg says in a podcast, there are things that he says private in a one-on-one dinner. Maybe it's actually network still matters if the network's super elite and where you really can have an edge, where you're accessing the actual private thoughts of the most interesting or smartest people. The mass market thinking is indeed more publicly accessible.
There's no doubt that who you know is beneficial. So I really was just talking about the relative to the what you know over time. And obviously that could change. So maybe over the last 30 years, the what you knows have been more emergent than they were in the past. They may go down. And this, as you mentioned, this era of trust is very interesting. Maybe you only trust a very small number of people, and you may just happen to trust one of the who you knows who is networked to a lot of folks.
Maybe the what you know with AI and all these jobs that we didn't think would ever be AI touched, like, hey, I'm a graphic designer and I really know how to do graphic design. That's actually more at risk versus the, hey, I have this 15-year relationship.
That's a really good point. The AI is probably going to attack the what you knows faster than the who you knows. It's interesting because technology in the, let's say, the social network trend attacked the who you knows, whereas the AI trend definitely attacks the what you knows faster than the who you knows. If that trend becomes more emergent, then we would see more of a increase in the who you knows.
That's a good topic for a blog post.
We should go write one.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Yeah. Now, we also have this rise of gig work, remote work. Where do you see like the macro trends of that happening?
I think obviously AI is the next super cycle in terms of how it's going to shape the world of work and who exactly is that threat there. I default to rebellion, contrarian, wherever everyone else is agreeing. I tend to try to take a different view. On the remote work thing, I think that's still a trend that's playing out. And what's so interesting to me is we started with, during COVID, remote work's everything. Then there's been recently, the last few years, a backlash. We're recording this in late September. Just a couple of days ago, Andy Jassy at Amazon announced a 5-day-a-week back-to-office policy at Amazon. That policy has been widely celebrated by many of the people in tech who I respect. I think it's probably conventional wisdom right now in Silicon Valley that you got to be in office and co-working together IRL to build great companies. And so we swung back to that direction. I think there is really a future for remote work. I think places like the Bay Area have these structural problems with housing that are not going to be solved anytime soon. So I'm actually still bullish on remote and distributed workplaces. I think that trend, it's still early days. It's not like, well, that's over. We've all figured that out. I actually think that there will be many, many more companies that go remote or that do hybrid setups in sophisticated ways or different types of people. And I think what I saw interesting about the Amazon announcement was this critique of somebody said, well, it's back to the office, except if you're a really high performer, in which case you go to your manager, ask for an exception, and an exception will be granted. And this is actually this very pernicious dynamic inside all these companies that have gone back to the offices. There's a set of elite employees that are like, fuck that. I've been working from home 2 or 3 days a week. It's much better. If you implement this policy, I'll leave. And now you've got this 2-tier system inside the company, which is actually worse, I would argue, than a unified approach.
I have a lot of friends at Amazon. It's an amazing company. Most of my friends, their teams, they might be in the office in Seattle, but they work with somebody in Austin and somebody else in New York and somebody else in Washington, D.C. They're all on the same team. Their meetings are on video every day. They're actually not meeting in person with people.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have a friend too who works at a financial services firm and he lives outside of New York. He commutes into Manhattan every day to Zoom with colleagues on the West Coast. So maybe like early stage startups.
You can literally touch them. It's not only you're in the same office, you're in the same room.
Yeah, exactly. And then the problem, of course, is early stage startups can't afford talent in the Bay Area, New York, and so forth. And so they're actually more inclined for cost reasons to try to distribute, or they can't afford office space or whatever. And so they're the ones being more remote by default. And it's the big companies implementing these back to office policies. But you're right. So many of these big companies, they're working with these global distributed teams. It's stupid to spend all this time in traffic just to jump on Zoom the rest of the day.
Even if you're in the same office complex in Mountain View or something, you're still often on a video call because you just don't want to go spend the 15 minutes going to the other office complex, biking there or something.
Or it's like 4 of you are in person, but there's the one colleague in Bangalore. So to make it fair, best practices, let's all be on Zoom. I think the meta point I just make on this, which is interesting, is I think a lot of times we declare that certain trends are over before they actually are. It's kind of like, oh, remote work, like we've hashed this out. Remote was big, it wasn't. Now it's on to the next trend. I remember Reid Hoffman saying this once about social networking. People have been declaring the end of social networking for years. It's all been settled. All the networks have been established. Frequently, the game isn't over when people think it is. It can sometimes just be getting started. And so I do always appreciate thinkers or people who thoroughly unpack or explore the ongoing nuances. And I think this remote work thing could continue to be the central trend of the workplace for years to come. And there's a lot more permutations.
It would seem to me that if you're a betting person and you say, are there going to be more remote hours worked in 20 years from now than there are today, it would seem likely that there will be more. I don't even know that that's controversial to make that prediction.
I don't think so. I think the macro story of our lifetime is the rise of the rest. It's hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty, getting online for the first time, getting educated, having an AI tutor in their pocket, and contributing to the global knowledge economy. If you think about how are companies going to source talent in the future, it seems inevitable that we're going to find incredible people wherever they are. And this idea that they're all going to live in the 49 square miles of San Francisco is just foolish.
You wrote this interesting blog recently about the right amount of early success, which I really liked. Walk me through your thinking there.
So I came at this a little bit from the venture fund context. So the conventional wisdom would be the ideal amount of success for a fund one is maximum. LPs and GPs all want the maximum amount of success. Let's say you raise a $5 million fund, you want that fund to be a 50x fund. But the problem with early success, and there's a venture fund that I won't name, but that actually their fund one was like $5 or $6 million. Today they have billions under assets under management. And what happens with a lot of early success is you scale up. You say, I'm so brilliant, or LPs tell you, you're so brilliant, and they shovel money. And so a $5 million fund two becomes a $200 million fund, fund three becomes a $1 billion fund. And quickly, you're operating a strategy that has nothing to do with your strengths or edge in market, and returns really suffer.
Because of overconfidence.
Overconfidence, you're playing in a different game. To be successful as a multi-stage $1 billion fund is different than a game that is to be successful as a $5 million seed fund. So your assets haven't changed, but the competition has changed. And so you can't win in the new market. And I've sort of extrapolated this into a life context where you can imagine people who come out of the gate out of college in their early 20s as superstars, and they get tons of accolades and so forth. And then sometimes they can peter out or burn out or bite off more than they chew. And so the question was, is there an optimal level of success? Let's take a fund context. Of course, you want the fund to be successful, but maybe you want fund one to actually be a 5x fund.
3x would be amazing.
3x fund is still mostly top quartile, top decile venture capital. So like a 3x fund, awesome. Every LP will want to re-up. You're going to make plenty of money and you can feel good about it. You have a confidence that's helpful, but you're also less likely to prematurely scale. You're less likely, both psychologically, the effect of arrogance, but also practically, like how you set up the fund, the resources you assemble and so forth, where you spend your time. And so maybe you'll build a stronger foundation for funds 2, 3, and 4. The argument would be over a 20-year period of time in terms of the long-term success of that franchise, would you rather fund one be like a 3x and then be better positioned for funds 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to each be 3, 5, 6x, 2x versus the 25x fund one and then all the future funds suck because of overscaling? And so I think there could be something to this. And I'm really intrigued by people who have a lot of early success, but then can't repeat it or shrink under the pressure. And I'm curious if you've seen that play out.
So you think in a career it could be similar as well?
I can make the counter argument. The rich get richer. There is a compounding value to network and brand and so forth. So that's conventional wisdom. Early advantages compound. But I think in a career context, if you were to say, you got this talented kid who's now 21 years old, what amount of success do you want them to have between 21 and 26 to set them up for maximum long-term life success? I'm not sure I'd pick maximum success for 21 to 26. I would worry about premature scaling effect for that person.
These things go to people's heads. It's like the child actor syndrome where they end up on drugs or whatever it might be.
You had a line, Auren, years ago about reaching down, not just reaching up, trying to connect with people who are behind you actually on the totem pole.
Certainly easier to do that. Yeah. That was my strategy.
Most people like, how do I meet people who are more successful than me? That's the typical networking approach. And I'm actually going to try to find up-and-comers. And I think that actually is grounded in a humility of, no, I can learn from everybody and I might be objectively richer than this person or whatever, but they still have something to teach me. Spectacular early success causes people to not be in learning mode as much. They get into talking mode and teaching mode. And that's really detrimental for a long-term career.
I feel like the people I know who got like super successful in their early 20s, it's not that often that happens, but it's hard to build friendships because you don't really know who to trust. Do they like me just because of my money and because of my success? Either they go back to like very, very family relationships, or they've got these very odd relationships where they're kind of their boss, but they're not kind of their friend. That's a very important time. You're still becoming who you are in your 20s.
I think that's spot on.
Nobody would ever take less success, though. There's no real way to think about it.
Well, is there a way to stay grounded while being massively successful? If you could have the 60x fund one and be really sober about how you plan and resource fund two, that would be the best of all worlds. I think this is an interesting question for all of us to reflect on, which is, what does it mean to stay grounded? What does it mean to touch grass? What does it mean to not let success and momentum get to your head? I'm really intrigued by this because if you watch any interview with a successful person, they'll always say, oh, luck was a big part of my success and so forth. Do you really believe that? That's the kind of high status answer. Buddhism, where I've been spending a lot of time meditating in the last 15 years, and they distinguish between knowledge and wisdom. You can read about the principles of Buddhism or whatever in a book, but it comes to as knowledge, not wisdom. The only way that wisdom is gained is through seeing the truths for yourself, experiencing them for yourself, this experiential element of understanding impermanence or not self.
And do you believe that? Do you really think that's the only real way to get wisdom?
I don't think it's the only way, but I do think that all of the wisdom in the world has been written down. All of the best practices in business have been like more or less codified. And yet people continue to not follow the wisdom. People continue to make mistakes where it's been written down, don't do that. This will cause you pain and suffering. And people continue to do those things. And then they realize, oh yeah, I guess I should have listened to that advice.
I know I shouldn't have 10 chocolate chip cookies in one sitting, but like every once in a while, I just succumb and do it anyway.
That's like a knowing doing gap. I would argue that's like you having the knowledge that there's a certain way to be healthy, but then it's hard to actually implement behavior. I don't know if it's too cute to distinguish between knowledge and wisdom in that context. Is there such a thing as like health and wellness wisdom that like leads to better follow through on action? But my observation is that I see a lot of people make the same mistakes and sort of ignore cliche best practice wisdom. And my takeaway is, no, it's because they have to learn it themselves. They have to experience the mistake and the consequences themselves. The reason why this framework around too much early success is because I fear that if you have the 60x fund or whatever, and then you go talk to 10 smart people who tell you, okay, young Jedi, don't let this go to your head, don't overscale, whatever, you won't be internalized.
Feel like, of course, I'm smarter than these guys.
I'm different. I'm the exception. I won't fall prey to the thing everyone else did.
Interesting. We mentioned this connecting, networking type of thing. Who you know is still important. How do you think about how one should be implementing it or how one should be thinking about it strategically?
Generally, I think the last word, strategically, is a good word. It speaks to actually the core tension of this whole topic, which is, on the one hand, you actually want to be strategic when you think about your network. Whether you're an entrepreneur running a business and thinking about the network around your company, or whether you're just an individual running your career, thinking about your professional network, you actually want to be strategic. You want to be intentional. You want to be proactive. And yet, at the same time, if you do anything that makes it seem like you're being overly calculated, overly strategic, it actually undermines the entire endeavor. And so it's this very interesting tension where the people who build the most effective networks, and I think of yourself as one of them, are people who actually are pretty organized about how they think about their network. They're pretty strategic. They make a point to spend time with interesting people, and they make a point to stay in touch and follow up and all the rest. And yet they do so in a way that's so authentic and natural that it doesn't come off as slimy. And the novelist Jonathan Franzen had this line of, the people who are most obsessed with authenticity tend to be some of the least authentic people. There's this sense in which even talking about it in the way we are right now, Auren,
it seems so crass.
Even having the meta conversation can feel awkward. And yet it's important still to be thinking about it strategically and intentionally.
How does one think through the serendipity? For somebody like you probably get so many inbounds, so many people like, hey, let's meet up, let's chat. If you take every one of them, you literally don't have the time. You can't do it. If you never take one, well, then there's these gems that you find all of a sudden. How do you decide to do that serendipity side?
I think it's one of the things I worry about actually as I've gotten older. I used to do massive amounts of serendipity. Almost anybody who reached out, I'd meet with them. I would go to events. I'd be very open-minded. And today I do much less. I'm much more filtered. I say no to almost everything. I rarely just do random meetings with people when they reach out. And even if it gets referred in, I'll usually let's do a 15-minute phone call. And I worry that I should be doing it more. The framework that I try to follow is that there are kind of different seasons of life when you want to have the serendipity spigot more or less open. I actually had coffee yesterday with a guy who I know, who I respect, who's in a career transition. He reached out to me. He's doing exactly what he should do in a career transition, which is you really open up the serendipity spigot big time. And you go and reconnect. You do lots of coffee meetings, you go to events, go to conferences, go to gatherings, and just sort of let stuff percolate. And I think there are also seasons of life where you're really heads down and super focused. To me, I'm always thinking about like, what season of life am I in between that binary? And of course, it's more subtle than just two stages, but there are phases where maybe you're trying to figure out a new strategy. Maybe you're feeling a little dissatisfied, a little burned out, and you want to introduce more randomness and serendipity. What you don't want to do as you have more success or have more commitments or obligations, family, whatever, is have the serendipity spigot open constantly, sort of unconsciously, because I think that can be distracting. How do you think about serendipity in your network?
Honestly, I have the same tension that you have. I remember you reached out to me in February 2003. if I remember correctly, your birthday's in March. You were about to turn 15 years old. I'm much older than you. So for some reason, I took the meeting. I don't even remember why I took it. You're a 15-year-old entrepreneur at the time. That's cool. And then we've been good friends ever since. It's been an incredible, great relationship for me personally. And I've learned a lot from you over those years. There's probably many of those that I missed because I didn't take it. So I've missed out on these many, many incredible relationships that I could have had over the years. I haven't done that many meetings with 15-year-olds, but I have taken plenty of meetings over time where it wasn't valuable for me or the other person. That's actually the most interesting thing is when somebody reaches out to you for a meeting, I find that sometimes they don't get value out of the meeting. And so it's one thing if you don't get value out of it, but if both sides don't get value out of it, this is a complete waste of time. If they're going to reach out to me and get a meeting with me, they should at least get a ton of value out of the meeting. They should come prepared and they should extract value out of it. Ideally, they give some value back. And if I'm ever going to reach out to somebody, I will ensure that at least one of us gets value out of the meeting for sure.
You were generous, not just spending time with me, but also when I was maybe 17 or something, you had me moderate a session on ethics and science at an event that you organized with a bunch of heavy hitters. And I remember asking you saying, I don't think I'm qualified to do this. And you're like, no, go for it. I think you can do great. People telling you that at formative ages can have a huge impact on their career. So I really am grateful for that.
Tyler Cowen is great at just saying, I believe in you.
Tyler Cowen did that to me as well. And I'm so grateful. People like you and him, I feel like I should be doing that more. If a 15-year-old emailed me today, I'm not sure I would actually jump on the phone. Maybe it depends. Maybe that's my takeaway from going forward. But this actually speaks to a couple things you raised that I think are important points just to amplify for folks listening here. One is both sides benefiting in some way is useful when thinking about interpersonal interaction in general. And I think a mistake a lot of young people make on this is there's no way it could possibly help Auren. How could I possibly add value? You can always add value. One thing I always tell young people is VCs and people in tech and people in business, the media, everyone, we're obsessed with what are young people thinking today? I firmly believe that anybody can get a meeting with anybody in the world if they work hard enough and they follow up enough. I think you can get a meeting with Bill Gates. How do you get on Bill Gates' calendar? Well, you figure out some piece of information that he would find valuable, an information that only you have that's in your head. Maybe you'll help him, or maybe you'll just show that you are attempting to help him, but that's key versus just a one-way value extraction. The other thing to say on this that's a little more subtle, but I think is key, is something I've learned in recent years on network building and relationships is for really busy people, they actually don't want to do agendaless coffee meetings. They're so busy to justify taking the time. There needs to be some transactional reason why the interaction is happening. I kind of think of this as like a transactional bluff, which is, let's just say you don't actually have a short-term transaction and you actually want to build a long-term relationship and you don't want to come at this person and say, I just want to do business with you and then never talk to you again. You still, for purposes of like getting on the calendar, need to have something specific that is the purpose. Actually, doing a podcast conversation is an example of like a transaction. It's harder to ask someone to catch up for an hour than to say, hey, let's record a podcast. It's basically like we're just catching up. This is the way that both of us can justify it being on our calendar for an hour. There's lots of things that you can do, I think, to come up with a transactional reason. The reason this is nuanced is the general advice is don't be transactional, be long-term, build authentic relationships and so forth. But then the nuance is you actually need to be a little bit transactional to schedule shit to get the kind of wheels turning in the relationship. And then once you're in the interaction, you don't have to be transactional while talking to the person.
I still think it's helpful to like have an agenda. What I think is tough is if you reach out to somebody to meet with them, maybe somebody you don't know that well or whatever, or maybe somebody you don't know at all, you want to be able to say, okay, I want some value from you, Ben. This is the specific thing I think you can help me on. Because sometimes people are like, hey, I need your help on this thing. But then you're like, I don't even know how I'm going to be able to help you. And the worst case scenario is you talk to them for 30 minutes, you don't help them at all. So at least they should have some sort of plan. And then you should be able to agree, oh yeah, I probably could help you there. That's great. And maybe helping them only takes 3 minutes of the 30-minute conversation or something. And then there's, okay, maybe we have other ways of doing that. Or, hey, I'm going to help you, Ben. And then they could show you some value as well. Now, I might be the second most famous Hoffman that you hang out with. You also hang out with Reid Hoffman, no relationship to me, unfortunately. What are some of the more counterintuitive lessons you've learned from him?
Well, I spent a couple of years working on books with Reid and then a couple of years as chief of staff, sort of setting up an initial organization for him, separate from LinkedIn and Greylock, to kind of advance his interests and activities across a set of things. And I learned a ton. I wrote an essay called 10,000 Hours with Reid Hoffman, in which I document a lot of the lessons learned. So there's so many things I've learned from him. I think about this with a lot of people I've learned from, where it's like, I'm not even sure I could disentangle what I've learned. It's just so deep. It's pure absorption more than tactical. But if I had to pull out one thing on Reed, and something that I still need to get better at, is he's very good at having people in his orbit with whom he doesn't agree fully or might not have a massive amount of overlap. There's an element of what they do or what they think that he finds really redeeming and valuable, and he maintains the friendship. So I once asked him after Microsoft bought LinkedIn whether he felt sad about that. And he once told me that he thinks of emotions like an 8-ball, where you can turn the 8-ball. There's usually experiences have many emotions built in at once. And so, yes, sadness was an emotion, but you can turn it, and there's also excitement. There's also pride. So I sometimes think of him with the 8-ball in this regard, which is sometimes people in your life are annoying or have some flaw or weakness. But if you turn it, if you view it from a different perspective, you can see, oh, actually, they have this attribute or quality or personality trait or interest that's actually really exciting or valuable or worthwhile. My problem is I'm more inclined to like just dismiss people or say, look, you have this one flaw or problem that's so annoying to me. I just don't want to spend any more time with you. Whereas Reed will actually like accept quite a bit of that in pursuit of the really redeeming, awesome quality. He'll overlook weaknesses, basically. And so he has some people who he works with or people who have all sorts of problems and major weaknesses. And some people are like, Reed, why are you spending time with this person? He's like, well, because their particular strength on this particular vector is so stupendous that it's worth having them in orbit.
It's interesting. A lot of successful people are like that, where they have these people in their orbit who are quite flawed, but they're able to find this redeeming quality somewhere in that person because they're just so world-class at this very, very specific thing. And maybe these successful people are just good at finding that thing. They're good at talent spotting in that way.
Yes. And I think it's a really good insight, because if it is a broader phenomenon, which I haven't thought about, one other explanation could be that because they're high status or wealthy or powerful, they're actually able to withstand the criticism that gets levied at them for affiliating or associating with this flawed person. And they can say, look, I know you don't like my friend Jane, but I don't care. And so whereas most of us mere civilians, if we got a lot of criticism for being friends with somebody or having someone in our orbit who's flawed, we might say, well, I actually have to really listen to that criticism. I have to care more about what people think. Billionaire moguls can say, I don't really give a shit. Oh, fine. You like me less. You respect me less. You don't want to give me money more. I don't care. I have all the money. I have all the power. I'm still going to be friends with this person. So maybe it is actually more common than I realized among these sorts of people.
It's hard to know if there's correlation and causation, because maybe they're successful. Part of the reason they're successful is because they've been able to find these pockets of innovation that other people would dismiss. I really hate being around people who are always late to things, but that's in some ways like a very, who cares if that person is really brilliant at some other thing? It just rubs me the wrong way. And maybe I missed out on working on these pure geniuses who are great at other things.
The causality question is interesting. Maybe some of the most brilliant, profound thinkers on Earth today also have these flaws that cause most people to dismiss them out of hand.
Even people who have like the most amazing insights. One of the guys who discovered DNA or something like that had some huge, crazy flaws. If you're friends with that person, hopefully you can filter. You can say, okay, I'll take the DNA thing, but I won't take your like crazy other conspiracies over here or something. And you can try to be that filter. You don't have to take everything somebody throws at you.
I think you do that really well. I remember having coffee with you once, or like lunch in San Francisco years ago. I think I told you like the Wall Street Journal recently wrote an article about X. And your response was, I don't believe that. I can't remember what the topic was, but I remember thinking, wow, that's one sign of sophistication or independent thought, is actually evaluating every assertion individually and not just saying, oh, well, because the Wall Street Journal asserted something, it must be true. Or because some smart, powerful person has some belief, that must be the right belief. Interacting with the atomic world, let's look at every atomic unit and see if I agree or disagree. World-class people are able to like look at a person and say they have 99 beliefs that are completely bogus, but this one belief is really interesting and really true. And whereas many of us are instead tempted to like wholesale accept is that an outlet or a person's fully credible in everything, or dismiss somebody as uncredible in everything. And I think being able to be more nuanced about it is a real superpower.
Most of us do that with our family members. You don't fire your family member. So you've got this crazy Uncle Fred. He's got some serious flaws or something like that, but you still love him because he's your family member and he's got some other redeeming qualities out there. We're kind of used to that. And no one will judge you. Okay, well, you have this crazy Uncle Fred. He's your uncle. That's just the way it is.
That's a great analogy. I think more people should apply that way of thinking to people in their professional network.
Now, speaking of profession stuff, on the venture capital firm, that's your full-time job. We're at a point where early stage valuations are still super sky high. They're probably even higher than they were at the 2021 peak. We have these super giant seed rounds, Mistral or the SSI, the $1 billion valuation with the AI stuff. What is happening right now in the market? And do you think this is sustainable? Where do you see it going?
I'm not sure early stage valuations are higher than the ZERP peak. I think they have come down. I think there is data from Carta and so on to support the fact that they've come down.
The YC ones still seem like they're in a different stratosphere.
Totally. And YC has a dynamic around it. I think a typical company coming out of YC today will target raising at 15 or 20 post.
Minimum, it seems.
Yeah, minimum. And that's in part because of the new YC deal with the uncapped note that YC puts in that's forcing founders to raise more at higher prices to make the dilution math work, which is an outcome that everyone anticipated when YC introduced the new deal. And I think the problem with it is if founders raise money at too high a valuation earlier in their journey, it limits their ability to raise future quality rounds. And I get that founders think this is just VCs advocating their interest, but Mark Lohr from Jet.com wrote a great post. The biggest mistake he made at Jet is like raising money at too high valuations. It can create problems down the road. So I don't think it's just VC self-interest.
Creates a lot of problems. And raising too much money, you'll still give away the same percentage. You just raise a lot more money.
You raise too much money. And it's interesting to circle back to our knowledge versus wisdom thing. Yes, you can read the article that says, don't let your burn get out of control until you have product market fit. The money's sitting in your bank account. No matter how you try to do it, founders end up spending that money.
It's too big of a force. You can't just let it earn interest.
So I think what we're seeing in valuations, the sort of obvious thing to point out is that there's AI and there's not AI deals.
Everything today is AI, right?
Of course, add .ai to your domain name and you're an AI company. But in terms of the true Gen AI stuff, we see those AI-centric deals often clearing 20 post for pre-seed or seed rounds, even with zero traction, no revenue, and so forth. But for the non-AI deals, our average entry price will be 7.5 to 10 million post-money valuations. So we think there are plenty of those deals to do. It means that you have to be great at discovering founders at the very beginning of their journey. That's hard to do. I think you have to have a strategy of inception stage discovery to do lower cost entry price venture investing. If you don't want to have a strategy around that and you just want to play an access game, then you're going to enter at seed and Series A north of 20 post.
In the mid 2000s, the average deal was maybe 5 posts or something. The average seed stage deal, you made it raise $1 million on 5 posts. That was pretty common back then. Maybe if you're really good, you're $1 million on 5 pre and have a little less dilution. If you just think the tech world has grown at least 10% a year since then, we're at 18 years. So that would be at least a 4x turn. If you just think of just normally, that same deal should be at 20 post today. If actually the exit valuations are at 10% what they were in the past.
Our mutual friend, Mark Pincus, did a fireside chat with me, and it's on YouTube if people want to watch, where he talks about the early financing rounds of Zynga. Mark was like a repeat founder. I think he had taken a company public when he started Zynga. So he was not like a first-time founder. And I think the Zynga round was like at 5 post or something, like the seed round. And so it's completely bonkers where we are today by comparison. One of two things will happen. Either the asset class will produce horribly in the coming vintages. That's one option. Obviously, neither you nor I would believe that because we're both running venture funds. What we have to believe is that exit values will be a lot higher than they used to be. That there will be more companies that exit for tens of billions of dollars to justify this higher entry price.
If you're paying 4x more at the entry, you got to get 4x more on the exit. Some of those venture firms did super well. Maybe you get 3x more on the exit and you still do okay.
I have a friend who believes VCs just made too much money in the last 30 years. Like it wasn't efficient. So, boo-hoo, VCs can make a little less money. That could happen. That could be an outcome. But I think generally it's not hard to tell a story about why there'll be larger tech outcomes in the years to come and why every business is becoming a tech business, software and AI transforming every industry, blah, blah, blah. So it's pretty credible to assert that there will be more value creation in the tech industry in the next 20, 30 years, which would justify these higher entry prices for VCs.
One of your innovation when you guys were founding the firm is you pioneered this more of a scout program, or at least scaled it up more than most other firms. How do you think about scaling that and what were your lessons learned from that?
It points back to your comment on entry price and finding founders at the beginning of their journey. So the premise of a scout program for venture is that you can empower non-professional, non-full-time people, i.e. professors, other founders, angel investors, operators, executives, and you can empower them with capital to go back their smartest friends. And what's contrarian about this strategy is most people think that the only way you do good investing is you put the money in the hands of full-time professional investors. But in seed stage venture, what we discovered is that a lot of founders' first phone call when they're starting a company is not to the big bad VC. It's to a fellow founder friend. It's to their professor. It's to their former boss. Those are the people who are the first call. And so the idea is if you want to get in that very first round, you have to have partnerships and capital in the hands of people who are the first call angels or first call GPs. At Village, we run a somewhat decentralized network where we're working closely with people who we believe are first call for founders across different venture categories, cybersecurity, enterprise SaaS, whatever. It's in partnership with their conviction that we will invest in that company. I think one of the things we've learned about managing this network is people are motivated to participate in a network like ours for different reasons. Some of them care a lot about making money in economics. Some of them care about the status dynamics of being in an elite community. And then there's everything in between. And so one of the reasons why communities and networks are hard to scale is because I do think to do them well, you have to take a bespoke white glove approach to how you interact with these individual network nodes. You have to meet them where they are. Are they really keen on exclusive event invitations? Okay, that's what you're going to have to do. Are they keen on learning from other people? Are they trying to build more friendships? What's driving them to engage in the network? It's too simplistic to think, oh, just share carry with them or give them a spiff of cash if you do a deal and that's all that matters. A lot of people who are doing investing already have made some money, frankly. And so there's other things that work.
You obviously have many more scouts than you have people on your team. How do you manage them? Do you have in some ways like a customer success person in your firm that manages them?
It's a good way to think about it. Or you can think about it like each of the full-time employees at Village will oversee a set of relationships in the community and kind of be their point of contact. So you do have to add bodies at HQ to scale a network, but obviously it's not linear. So each person can manage more than just one other relationship. And so, yes, we do work with many more people in the network than we have employees. At Village today, we have 13 full-time people, and many of us are responsible for different cohorts of angels and other people we call our network investors.
For these scouts that are out there, I assume you can have a scenario where someone doesn't refer any deals for a whole year because they just don't see anything worth referring to you.
The way we think about it is a lot of the people we're partnering with are experts in different product dynamics or market dynamics. And what we at Village HQ are world-class at is founder evaluation, talent evaluation across categories, because we're a generalist fund. Our network investors tend to be people who are specialists in different categories. And then at Village HQ, we're adding a talent lens to that analysis to make together a really great investment decision. But yeah, you have to cultivate this network. And because these are not full-time investors, they often have other jobs. Sometimes they won't do a deal for a long time. And of course, you want to be careful that you're not checking in with them in a way that causes them to just do a deal to do a deal. Cultivating this is actually really hard, which is why every venture firm says they have a network strategy. We say Village is network native because since the very beginning of the firm, we've been focused on doing this very subtle work of creating an ecosystem and checking in and building relationships. It's a lot harder than people think it is for a lot of these reasons.
You mentioned you're really good at evaluating the founders. Is there some sort of formula? How does one do that? Because of course, at the stage that you're investing in, it is the most important thing. You don't have a lot to go by at that point. There's not a lot of history in the company, at least. What do you do to evaluate the people?
Here's what I'd say about talent evaluation in the venture context. A lot of VCs and investors are very sloppy and lack rigor when they do founder quality evaluation. They apply rigor when they do market analysis. They'll actually do a TAM analysis. They'll apply rigor when they think about product. They'll actually use the product. They'll rate the product and so forth. But they're very sloppy when it comes to founder quality. I was talking to a friend of mine who works at a well-known top-tier venture firm, and they said the most overused word inside our firm is the word special with respect to founders. They sit around during investment team meetings. This person's a really special founder. And no one knows what the hell special means. they quickly pivot the conversation back to product and market because you can kind of sound smarter with more quantitative or analytic frameworks when talking about those things.
You can kind of understand the company by looking at the deck and the numbers, and not everyone in the firm meets the founders. Is there a way to understand the founders without meeting them? Is there a way to have that discussion? If only, let's say, 2 of the 13 of you have met the founders, how do you actually have that discussion around the founders?
At Village, we tend to record most of the pitch meetings we do with founders. They automatically get summarized. We don't actually record the video. We just get the transcript and summary. I could see a world where we record video and where with better AI editing and mashups, what you could circulate is the 5-minute highlight reel of the hour pitch to get all of your colleagues to sort of feel the energy of the founder. I do think recording meetings, every interview we do when we hire people at Village, we use our portfolio company MetaView to record interviews. It's really game changing to get better at interviewing and have all of your colleagues on the same page about what other people have already asked them and make sure you cover new ground or come back to delicate topics. I think there will be opportunities to be more rigorous around this particular dimension of getting people on the same page around the founder interviews. But one thing I would say just in terms of the process of evaluating founder talent is I think what we're trying to do more of at Village is develop a scorecard, write down the criteria we're looking for in founders, and rate founders 1 through 5 on those criteria.
Oh, so on each criteria, not just overall 1 through 5, but on each criteria.
So what we do today is we actually just do overall 1 through 5 on the criteria, and then we check a box on the sub criteria. So we don't actually sub-rate the criteria. And we do that of a product market founder.
Is this person charismatic or so, yes or no kind of thing?
Yeah, the history of incredible at iteration and moving quickly. Founder market fit. Are they put on this earth to work on this business? Are they obsessed with this problem area, which is distinct from mere passion? They should have encyclopedic knowledge on the thing they're building, right? They should be teaching you constantly about every element of the thing they're working on. Do they reference well? People who've worked with them well, and worked with them a lot in the past. Do they vouch for this person? Looking for those criteria. So this isn't rocket science. Like a checklist is not rocket science. A tool of one. I wrote a great book on checklists. It's amazing how many VCs and investors don't actually use checklists just to organize their thinking.
That makes sense. Okay, what are the things you think do make a great founder? Let's go through the checklist. You don't need to have everything on the checklist, but they should have many things on the checklist.
For those who aren't familiar with Atul Gawande's work on this, he writes about how washing your hands in a hospital is the most important thing doctors can do to not spread disease. You can tell doctors a million times, wash your hands, and people keep forgetting. And so just a checklist that doctors review before they enter a surgical room. And step 1 is wash your hands. There's nothing super profound about what you should look for in a founder. I couldn't tell you a criteria we look for at Village that you would say, wow, I never thought to think about that for a founder. Remembering to look for each of the criteria, that's the hard part.
And then at least you can go back in time. If you made the investment or chose not to make the investment, go back in time and calibrate that.
Calibrate. And if you have an investment team, if you have colleagues, this creates good structure for good dialogue, because then you can look at your checklist, I can look at my checklist, and we can say, oh, Auren, looks like I checked incredibly ambitious, you didn't. Let's talk about that difference. Or it looks like you scored this person 4 out of 5, I scored them 2 out of 5. Why the difference? So it creates a context for structured conversation and debate internally.
You write a lot. You've wrote at least over 1 million words on your blog. One blog I liked, you wrote this Goldilocks theory of building rich, where you kind of challenge some of these stereotypes of the super rich. Walk us through a couple of those.
The Goldilocks theory of wealth is basically this idea that there's actually an optimal amount of wealth that would most correlate with happiness. And it's probably not maximum wealth. But obviously, it's not poverty. And it's not even whatever the number of people say, oh, above $60,000 of income doesn't make a difference. That's been disproven. But there's some optimal level. And it depends a little bit on who you are and where you live and so forth. But this idea is that for many founders and entrepreneurs, people kind of in our orbits, it would behoove them to sort of think about life path relative to optimal amount of wealth. Because I say this as a VC, we want to back people who want to create multi-billion-dollar businesses and create billions of dollars of exit value for everyone. But if I were to give life advice to an entrepreneur and they were to ask me, what type of business should I build to optimize my happiness? I'm not sure the obvious answer would be go build a venture-backed startup that could become a $10 billion business where you sell most of the company to your investors and so forth. I think a business that could generate $5-10 million of profit for you, a business that you wholly own, more or less, where you have this incredible lifestyle, lots of autonomy, where you're not famous, no one knows who you are. From what I understand about happiness and inner peace, that actually is probably more optimal than people who create billions of dollars of wealth.
It is interesting that Most super wealthy people I know do seem very happy. I haven't found that there's a massive happiness gap there. And I would say they're certainly happier on average than people who are less wealthy. Do you agree with that, or do you think that is not true?
It depends what we mean by super wealthy.
Maybe the Elon Musk does not seem as happy.
Elon Musk has said he's not happy. He said, my life is like eating glass and staring into the abyss. I would challenge that in the billionaire class. I think there are a lot of billionaires who actually struggle with inner peace. But in terms of the mass affluent or Silicon Valley wealthy, hey, they started a company, they sold it for $300 million. Yeah, those people, they tend to be happy. I'd agree with you. It's very hard to do what you did with LiveRamp and so forth. Those are very unusual outcomes. The venture path usually doesn't end up that way for people. And usually it bifurcates into like extraordinary outcome or zero. I think the path to happiness, if this is the thing you're optimizing for, which it doesn't have to be, but like if you just are strictly optimizing for happiness, I think like a bootstrapped business. I saw Greg Eisenberg on your podcast, Auren. He's a big fan of this kind of stuff. These sorts of businesses that he wholly owns. You make a few $1 million a year of profit, free cash flow. That's a really happy life.
There's a point where you don't have to think about money as much. That takes away a lot of stress. But then there's a point where you're just so much in the competitive race where kind of almost adds the stress. Probably for everyone, that point is in a different place.
In a different essay I wrote called The Status Cocaine, the status cocaine issue affects everyone on the whole spectrum, I think. Like there's always someone above you. There's always kind of this rat race feeling. And we all have to have a strategy for sort of disentangling our hearts and minds from that. But I think this idea that you don't have to worry about money, but also you're not so wealthy where how to give it away becomes a major topic in anxiety. I remember George Clooney once said that he once organized like a dinner with his 12 childhood friends and he gave them each $1 million at the dinner. He gave them each an envelope that had like $1 million in it each. And he said this story with like great pride. I was thinking to myself, that seems like one of the worst things to do.
Oh my gosh, that seems terrible.
You've taken your 12 childhood friends, you just each handed them $1 million of cash. I'm sure they're grateful to you, but you've just permanently fucked up your friendship with them the rest of your life.
Yeah, one thing to buy your mom a house or something.
Totally. Yeah.
That's weird. All right, a couple of personal questions before you leave. What is a conspiracy theory that you believe?
I don't have a conspiracy theory that I can think of, so I'm curious to ask you that same question. What is a conspiracy theory that you believe on?
I believe in a lot of conspiracy theories.
What's one of them?
Whenever I see somebody advocating for something, I always think who's behind that person or organization that would benefit from that avocation. So anytime I see anything, someone may be advocating out of the goodness of their heart, I'm going to stop the pipeline or something. It's truly out of the goodness of their heart. But there's often someone who might be like subtly manipulating that person for their own profit motive or for their own geopolitical motive or something. So I often will look at like who's behind that thing. It's not always the case that there is, but there's often that thing.
Have you read Glenn Loury's new memoir?
No.
Oh, it's a must read. So Glenn Loury, the economist.
Yeah, he's got a great, interesting, crazy life story.
I mean, it's one of the craziest life stories I've ever read. When you start reading it, give yourself 3 hours. You won't be able to put it down.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm definitely reading this.
One of the great phrases he uses, he says the cover story and the real story. So he's like, the cover story was, I was this rising professor at Harvard, but the real story is X. And I just think that frame of the cover story and the real story is very true. So I'm with you on, there's frequently some underbelly story that isn't transparent that I, like you, seek to understand.
There's a conspiracy to basically change something without people knowing that you were involved in it in some sort of way. All right, last question we ask all of our guests. What conventional wisdom or advice do you think is generally bad advice?
Something you told me once, Auren, that had a big effect on me was you said something like 70% or 80% of achievement people are really goal-oriented and 20% of achievement folks are not goal-oriented. They're not big on goal setting. That made me feel good because I've never been a big goal setter. When we first met when I was 15, I never thought that, in my mid-30s, I want to be a venture capitalist. Similar to how we started this conversation about career advice, to be a great entrepreneur is to be incredibly adaptive and to seize opportunity and serendipity where it emerges. And I think conventional advice around set long-term goals, work backwards, I can see how it's valuable in certain contexts. And it's not to say never set long-term goals and so forth. But by and large, I think getting comfortable with the uncertainty of life, getting comfortable with the role of serendipity and just letting things unfold is a real gift and actually requires a cultivation. I think you have to cultivate that mindset, that ability, but it's something that I try to cultivate. And when people like you told me that it was okay to do that, it made me feel a lot better. So my message for folks listening is, if you don't know what you want to do in 10 years, if you don't have a long-term goal, that's okay. It might even be an advantage.
Now, what do you think of long-term, more personal goals? I want to be this type of person, or I want to be in a committed relationship. I want to give back in some sort of way. What about those types of goals?
My friend Cal Newport and I have talked about developing personal principles or values. And sometimes values can be aspirational. I aspire to be this kind of human. I'm sympathetic to that. I would like to do more of that. I don't view that as in contradiction with a point around career milestones or life outcomes. I think it's a good nuance.
But what about when you're 18 and you're like, okay, one day I want to be happily married in a relationship, loving relationship. Do you think that should be a goal that people have? And obviously they could change their mind later. Or do you think that is a limiting thing?
Generally speaking, I think specific outcomes like that can be limiting. It'd be better just to stay open-minded and play the game on the field that's right in front of you. I think a long-term principle of happiness, generosity, integrity, to love and to be loved, however that will play out in my life, that's kind of what I would tell the 18-year-old versus by age 35, I must be married with 2 kids. I just view the anxiety that tends to compound in people to be actually counterproductive.
Especially at 33, that will start to really have high anxiety if you're not married by then.
I know people who at age 43 have fallen in love and lived happily ever after. It can happen.
Of course. All right. This has been amazing. I knew it would be amazing because, well, we've always had so many amazing conversations. In fact, of all of our one-on-one conversations, this is the first one we've recorded, but we've had so many of these over the years. So I'm really excited. Thank you, Ben Casnocha, for joining us on World of DaaS. Of course, I follow you, not just because you're my friend, but because I admire you, at Ben Casnocha on X. And I definitely encourage our listeners to engage with you there. This has been a ton of fun.
Thanks so much, Auren.
If you're a super data nerd, go to worldofdaas.com. That's DAAS, worldofdaas.com, and sign up for our weekly Data as a Service Roundup newsletter. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, consider rating this podcast and leaving a review. For more World of DaaS, and DaaS is DAAS, you can subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere you get your podcasts. And also check out YouTube for videos. You can find me at Twitter at Auren, that's AUREN, Auren, and we'd love to hear from you. World of DaaS is brought to you by SafeGraph. SafeGraph is geospatial data for physical places. Check it out at safegraph.com. And by Flex Capital. Flex Capital invests in data companies like those we talk about at World of DaaS. Check it out at flexcapital.com.